When my phone rang that afternoon, I almost didn't pick it up. The caller ID lit up with Dad, and something in my gut twisted. We hadn't spoken much since I moved out last year, not because of any dramatic falling out, just the usual slow decay of contact when someone stops pretending to need what they've already outgrown. But I answered anyway, thinking maybe he was calling to catch up, or, more likely, to ask for something. I wasn't ready for what came next. His voice was sharp, clipped, the way it always got when he thought he was delivering wisdom wrapped in control. He skipped over greetings and went straight for the kill. "You need to be at Olivia's wedding next month," he said. "Non-negotiable. Family shows up for family. If you don't, I'm cutting you off. No more tuition, no more support. I'm done funding this rebellious phase." It hit me like a slap, not because I was afraid, far from it, but because the sheer arrogance of his assumption caught me off guard. I sat there, cross-legged on my apartment floor, surrounded by sketches for a new urban gray water filtration system my firm had just greenlit, and stared at my phone like it had grown teeth. I could hear him breathing on the other end, puffed up with the confidence of someone who still believed he had the power to dictate my life with his wallet. The same man who once told me that environmental engineering was a cute hobby and not a real career. What he didn't know, and what I wasn't about to tell him in that moment, was that he hadn't been paying my tuition for over a year. I had graduated summa cum laude 6 months ago. My diploma was framed on the wall behind me, not that he'd ever asked about it. Not that he'd ever come to the ceremony. He didn't know I'd landed a job at one of the top green tech startups in the country, that I had a corner workstation in a building powered entirely by solar, and a salary that exceeded what most of my peers dreamed of earning 5 years into their careers. I was pulling in $115,000 a year, managing my own projects, attending high-level meetings with sustainability leaders who actually listened when I spoke. The moment he threatened me, I realized something I hadn't fully processed until then. He still thought I was the dependent, desperate kid he used to manipulate with threats of financial ruin. He thought that holding the purse strings gave him control over my choices, my presence, my loyalty. He had no idea I'd quietly cut those strings a long time ago. I didn't interrupt him. I let him go on about family values, about obligations, about how Olivia had always looked up to me, and how not showing up would be a devastating betrayal. He talked about respect like it was a one-way street, a currency I owed him for being the kind of father who put food on the table but couldn't remember my major if his life depended on it. I sat there and listened, each word calcifying something in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like a kind of cold, deliberate clarity. He was trying to intimidate me into attending a wedding I hadn't even been invited to until 2 weeks ago. Olivia hadn't spoken to me in almost a year. Not since I told her I wouldn't be her maid of honor because I had a major product launch that week, and she exploded, calling me selfish and self-absorbed and too intense about this whole engineer thing. She'd blocked me on every platform the next day. No explanation. No conversation. Just gone. And now, suddenly, her big day was a family emergency I was expected to rearrange my life for, or else. I remember looking at the clock on my wall while he talked. 3:12 p.m. I had a meeting in 18 minutes, but for some reason, this call felt more pressing. It wasn't about the wedding. It wasn't even about Olivia. It was about control, about a man used to getting his way using money as leverage. And it was about me finally saying no in a way that would leave no room for doubt. When he paused, probably expecting me to fold with some half-apology or frantic promise, I took a breath and let the words spill, slow and clear. "Dad," I said, "you haven't paid a cent of my tuition in over a year." Silence. I graduated in May. Summa cum laude. I already have a job, 6 figures, full benefits, full independence. I've been paying my own rent, my own bills, everything. So if you think threatening to cut me off is going to scare me into obedience, you're about a year too late. He didn't say anything. I could almost hear the gears grinding, trying to reconcile the image he'd held of me with the reality I'd just dropped in his lap. I wanted to feel triumphant, but all I felt was tired. "I'm not coming to the wedding," I added. Not because I don't care about Olivia, but because I'm not going to be guilt, threatened, or manipulated into showing up for people who only reach out when they need something. Still, silence. I waited, but the line remained dead. Then, finally, he muttered something about being disappointed and hung up. No goodbye. No acknowledgement. Just gone. I stared at my phone for a long time after that. Not sad, not even angry anymore, just done. Completely, irreversibly done. The ultimatum had been empty, but the damage was real. Not because he could hurt me now, but because he still thought he could. Growing up in Santa Clara felt like being stuck in someone else's family photo, always standing just outside the frame, always cropped out of the moments that mattered. From the time I was old enough to notice the way my parents' eyes lit up when Olivia walked into a room, I understood my place. I was the background noise, the footnote, the other daughter. Olivia, 3 years younger than me, was everything they wanted, a smiling, social, golden-haired spectacle of charm and curated perfection. She could bat her lashes and have the world bend around her. I could win state science fairs and make the honor roll year after year, and it barely earned a nod over dinner. It wasn't like I expected confetti or fanfare. But the silence was brutal in its own way. When I got into AP chemistry a year early, my mom glanced up from her phone long enough to mutter, "That's nice," before asking Olivia if she wanted new shoes for the homecoming dance. Meanwhile, Olivia was getting custom dresses for every school event, a car on her 16th birthday, a sweet 16 party that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. It didn't matter that she never lifted a finger academically or that she coasted on charisma and connections. She was the daughter they liked to show off, the one they described with glowing terms like vivacious and stunning at neighborhood barbecues, while I stood off to the side awkwardly holding a lemonade, waiting to be acknowledged. My achievements were always too quiet, too intellectual, too hard to brag about. I worked my ass off in high school. While Olivia was being driven to cheer practice in the BMW they leased for her, I was riding my bike to the library and my part-time job at a local tutoring center. I stacked my schedule with AP courses, volunteered at the recycling center on weekends, and spent nights studying until my eyes blurred because I knew no one was coming to save me. If I wanted out of that house, out of that dynamic, out of being the forgotten daughter, I had to earn every inch of freedom myself. When I got into college on a full academic scholarship, there was no celebration. No dinner. No cake. Just a dry good for you from my dad while he skimmed the news on his tablet. The same year, Olivia got accepted into a private arts institute in Los Angeles that cost nearly $50,000 a year. They paid the entire bill without hesitation. New apartment, new clothes, new furniture, a MacBook Pro, a tablet, and a $1,000 camera she never learned how to use. Every penny poured into a future she didn't even seem to want. They funded her lifestyle like she was a celebrity, while I scraped by working 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore, taking unpaid internships, and eating dollar ramen to make rent. There was no bitterness back then. At least, I didn't let myself feel it fully. I was too focused on survival. Every time I saw Olivia post on Instagram about some new trip or spa day or shopping spree, I'd force myself to look away. When my parents sent her care packages filled with makeup, candles, and gift cards while I got "Hope you're doing well" texts with no punctuation, I told myself it was fine. I was fine. I didn't need their approval, just their distance. But the contrast never stopped stinging. Olivia had an entire entourage of family attention orbiting her every move. My mom would fly down just to help her pick out curtains for her dorm room. Meanwhile, when I tore a ligament in my ankle freshman year and ended up in the ER alone, I had to Uber myself home and hop up the stairs on crutches in the rain. I told them about it a week later during a family call. They barely reacted. My mom said something about hoping I had Advil, and my dad changed the subject to the stock market. That was the night I stopped telling them anything important. Every milestone I reached was invisible to them. My first published article on sustainable urban development got picked up by a well-known environmental blog. My dad didn't even read it. Olivia posted a TikTok that went semi-viral for dancing in a Starbucks uniform, and suddenly, she was so creative and finding her voice. When I graduated top of my class, they didn't even come to the ceremony. Olivia had a scheduling conflict. Something about a photo shoot or maybe a brunch with her influencer friends. My mom said she didn't want to travel alone, and my dad claimed he had meetings. So I crossed that stage alone, in a cap I bought secondhand and shoes I'd re-glued twice, scanning the crowd for faces I knew weren't coming. And still, despite everything, I kept showing up. I sent holiday cards. I called on birthdays. I offered help when Olivia ran out of money because she spent $3,000 on festival tickets and forgot to budget for rent. Every time, I told myself maybe this would be the moment they saw me. Maybe this would be the time they realized I wasn't just the responsible one, the fallback, the plan B. I wasn't the spare. I was a person with value. I was someone worth showing up for. But that moment never came. Even now, years later, with a degree and a career and my own damn life, the echoes of those years still follow me. The unspoken lessons etched into me like scars. Be useful. Be quiet. Don't expect praise. Don't ask for help. Earn everything. Need nothing. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be tolerated. It's hard to unlearn being invisible when that was all you were ever allowed to be. By the time I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, I had already decided I wouldn't tell them. There was no announcement, no proud family post, no gushing message in the group chat. I wore my cap and gown, adjusted the gold valedictorian sash that clashed slightly with my robes, and smiled for the camera held by a friend from my cohort, knowing full well that no one in my family would be there and that they wouldn't notice it had even happened. And the saddest part? I didn't even feel disappointment anymore, just a muted, dull sort of confirmation of what I'd always known. Their attention had never belonged to me. When I was selected for a prestigious summer internship at one of the nation's leading clean energy labs during my junior year, the kind of opportunity professors wrote glowing recommendations for and recruiters remembered your name over, I didn't tell anyone at home. While I was spending 10-hour days developing low-cost filtration prototypes and attending think tank meetings where I sat across from scientists with patents to their names, the family group chat was busy debating linen napkin colors and wedding hashtags for Olivia's upcoming engagement party. The only message I ever saw addressed to me directly in that entire summer was a quick, can you Venmo Olivia 100? She wants to book her hairstylist this week. No question mark. No, please. Just a demand tossed into the void like I was a bank account that occasionally responded. So I stopped replying. I stopped sending updates. I stopped thinking of them as people who had any stake in my story. They didn't know about my final project that received a faculty commendation, or that my design had been submitted for consideration at a national green tech competition. They didn't know I was invited to speak on a student panel at an environmental engineering conference, or that I sat at a table with CEOs and CTOs who treated me like an equal. They didn't know because they never asked, and I stopped offering. When the offer from Helix Environmental Systems came in, an email with a formal PDF, a starting salary I had to read twice, and a benefits package that included relocation, stock options, and 5 weeks of vacation, I stared at the screen for a long time before quietly closing the lid of my laptop. It was the biggest moment of my life up to that point, the culmination of years of work and sacrifice, and the first person I told was my old roommate, not my parents. Not because I wanted to keep it a secret, but because they would have made it about something else. They always did. My dad would have said something about Helix's stock price or the politics of climate policy. My mom would have tried to loop it back to Olivia's fiancé's job at some consulting firm. My news would have died in their hands before it ever got a breath of air. It was easier to live like they weren't part of it at all. They never acknowledged my graduation, not even with a cursory congrats in the group chat. I didn't even get a text. The day came and went, and the only thing anyone talked about was Olivia's floral arrangements and the fact that the caterer didn't have a vegan entree. Olivia posted a picture of herself holding a bouquet in a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire tuition. She tagged my mom, my dad, her fiancé, and even the dog groomer, but not me. I don't even think she knew what day my ceremony was. I had stopped mentioning dates like that a long time ago. There was no point. So I celebrated alone. Quietly. I bought myself sushi and a bottle of mid-range Prosecco and sat on the floor of my apartment with my laptop open to the Helix onboarding portal. I remember clicking through the benefits options, selecting my preferred healthcare plan, reading about their employee development program, and feeling this strange, calm sense of control settle over me. I didn't need them to witness it. I didn't need applause or fanfare. I had built a life they knew nothing about, and that, in a way, felt like freedom. It didn't hurt anymore. That surprised me. I thought it would. I thought every unanswered call and overlooked accomplishment would stack up inside me like resentment bricks until eventually I'd explode or collapse. But instead, it was more like erosion. Quiet. Gradual. I had slowly carved out a version of myself that didn't depend on their recognition. I had become someone strong, capable, and whole in the absence of their approval. The group chat was still active, but I stopped reading it. There was always some new wedding drama, some posturing about Olivia's vision, or how the ceremony needed to be elegant but whimsical. I muted the thread eventually. Sometimes, when I was bored, I'd scroll back through just to see how long it had been since anyone mentioned me. I went 4 straight months without a single direct reference. 4 months of being invisible in a family I was supposedly part of. And honestly, that told me everything I needed to know. I had made it without them. All the late nights studying until my eyes burned. All the jobs, the unpaid internships, the ramen dinners and secondhand furniture and patched-up shoes. They were worth it. Not because they got me a good job or a fancy title, but because they gave me proof that I didn't need to be seen to succeed. I had already done the impossible, quietly and completely. I had built a future that didn't include them, and I wasn't looking back. It started as a quiet, persistent thought that refused to leave me alone. The need to sever the last thread, the final tie they might still believe gave them power over me. For all the independence I had built, all the silence I had weaponized, there was still one remaining claim they held like an IOU etched in obligation. It wasn't even something they mentioned anymore, but I knew my father carried it like a loaded gun, holstered and ready, a piece of leverage he could draw whenever it suited him. The tuition check they'd written during my first semester of college. $13,000. That's how much they'd contributed before I took over every penny of my education. Before I secured the scholarships, before the grants and the 3 jobs and the sleepless nights that paid for the rest. $13,000 for 4 months of lectures, textbooks, and the illusion that I still needed them. They held it like a debt I'd never quite repaid, even though I'd more than earned my way forward without them. And I knew, somewhere beneath the thin veil of civility, beneath every passive-aggressive remark and every dismissive glance, that they believed that money gave them ownership over my success. So I started saving. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even difficult, not with my new job and my strict budget. I funneled bits of my paycheck into a separate savings account, untouched, unmentioned. Every time I made a transfer, I felt a strange mix of fury and relief, like I was slowly buying back pieces of myself. I skipped dinners out. I paused my weekend trips. I walked instead of ordering ride shares, made my own coffee, sold a few things I didn't need. Every dollar deposited into that account was another step toward reclaiming my freedom on paper as well as in practice. It took me almost 7 months, but eventually the balance hit exactly $13,000. I stared at the number for a long time on my screen. Round, final, absolute. I could have wired it. Could have sent a bland email with a bank receipt and a note that read, "We're even." But that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want it to be an abstract transaction. I wanted it to be physical, deliberate. I wanted to place it in his hands, look him in the eye, and make it clear that whatever fantasy he still entertained about holding influence over my life ended here. So, I wrote a check. A real one. Blue ink on a crisp white slip with my name printed neatly at the top, the kind of checkbook I hadn't used since high school. It felt old-fashioned, symbolic, like I was signing off on a chapter that should have ended years ago. In the memo line, I wrote, "Fall semester reimbursement." No smiley face. No flourish. Just facts. I folded it once, slid it into a plain envelope, sealed it without writing a name on the outside, and tucked it into the inside pocket of the navy blue blazer I planned to wear to Olivia's wedding. I wasn't going because I had changed my mind or forgiven anyone. I was going because I needed the ending to be mine. They had written their version of my role in the family story for 23 years. This time I would be the one holding the pen. That envelope weighed nothing and everything. Every time I touched the pocket to check that it was still there, I felt a current run through me. Not anxiety, but anticipation. The kind that sits in your chest and tightens when you know a confrontation is coming, not the kind where you doubt what you're about to do. I didn't doubt. I had never been more certain of anything. That check wasn't about money. It was never about the $13,000. It was about reclaiming autonomy in the clearest, most undeniable terms. It was about standing in front of the man who had dangled his financial support like a leash for most of my life, who had believed for years that being a provider entitled him to loyalty without effort, respect without reciprocity. It was about saying, "Here is your money back. You gave it when I didn't know better, and now that I do, I'm giving it back, with interest in the form of my silence, my absence, my peace." I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need a speech or a scene. I just needed that one moment eye contact, envelope, nothing owed. And then I would walk away. No tears. No hugs. No reconciliation. Just the quiet, solid knowledge that they could never again claim to have built anything that belonged to me. The sun was already high when I pulled up to the wedding venue, a sprawling estate tucked into the hills of Napa Valley, where the vines rolled out like ribbons across the horizon, and everything smelled faintly of roses and expensive decisions. The parking lot was already full, valets jogging to and from Teslas and rented vintage convertibles. I didn't rush. I had planned this down to the minute, arriving a full 45 minutes after the ceremony was supposed to begin, knowing full well that the show wouldn't wait for me, and that no one would think to check whether I had come at all. The sky was flawless. The kind of blue that photographers pray for, where every color in the frame looks like a catalog. The guests were gathered in clusters around manicured gardens and champagne bars. String lights had been coiled meticulously through the archways and along the tent poles, casting golden halos across the stone patio. I stepped out of my car, smoothed the navy blazer I had picked with surgical precision, and felt the envelope still firm in the inside pocket, untouched and perfectly folded. That was all I needed. The moment I walked through the side entrance, I spotted them, my parents, standing in front of a floral arch, her with a glass of Prosecco raised in one hand, him with a scowl that deepened the second his eyes landed on me. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just walked toward them, my heels clicking sharply against the stone like a metronome counting down to impact. "You're late," my father said the second I was close enough. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient string quartet and the background chatter like a wire. "Typical," he added, glancing at his watch with exaggerated irritation. His suit was new, dark gray with a gold pocket square that matched the color scheme Olivia had posted about endlessly online. He looked like someone who had spent months preparing for this moment and didn't appreciate anyone spoiling the symmetry. My mother didn't even greet me. Her eyes scanned me from top to bottom, pausing at my shoes, my hair, and finally my dress. A simple dark green satin slip with a high neckline and no embellishments, chosen specifically because it didn't match the pastel palette of the bridal party. "That's what you wore?" she said flatly, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You couldn't have picked something more festive?" I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, but because they didn't deserve them yet. No hug. No, "we're glad you came." Not even a "how have you been?" Just criticism, like muscle memory. I let them fill the space with their disapproval. It suited them. The wedding planner was directing people toward the vineyard lawn for family photos, which were running behind schedule, of course. I followed at a distance, keeping to the outer edge of the crowd. The bridal party was already arranged like magazine cutouts, Olivia in the center, glowing in a strapless designer gown that sparkled under the sun like a chandelier, flanked by her husband-to-be and a parade of bridesmaids in coordinated blush silk. Everyone looked so polished, so rehearsed, so eager to freeze their perfection in digital permanence. That was when I stepped forward. I walked straight into the photo setup without apology, ignoring the startled gasp of the planner and the sharp intake of breath from my mother. Olivia's smile faltered but didn't break. She had always been good at maintaining her stage face. My father turned toward me, his mouth already open to scold, but I didn't give him the chance. I reached into my blazer, pulled out the envelope, and handed it to him with deliberate slowness, meeting his eyes the entire time. There was no smile on my face, no anger either, just absolute, unwavering calm. He took it reflexively, probably thinking it was a card or some belated gift. But when he opened it, his expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, and then to something closer to shock. He looked at the check for a long second, like he couldn't quite make sense of it. $13,000. The exact amount he had paid for my first semester of college. The amount he had used, silently and implicitly, to hold himself above me. He stared at the memo line, then at me. "What is this?" he asked, voice low but tight. I didn't blink. "It's the last thing you'll ever be able to say you gave me," I said. "Now we're square." For a second, the only sound was the click of a photographer's shutter firing by mistake and the soft wind shifting the fabric of the outdoor tent. I turned to Olivia, who was frozen mid-smile, her bouquet held stiffly in front of her like a shield. I didn't say a word to her. There was nothing left to say. The entire wedding had been a performance about image and legacy and curated happiness, and I was done playing the invisible extra in a show I never auditioned for. I turned back to my father. "I'm done pretending," I said quietly, but loud enough that everyone within the frame could hear me. "Pretending that this family has ever been something I wanted to belong to. That I owe you anything. That being here means something to me." And then, without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked away. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just steady, measured steps across the stone patio and back toward the parking lot. The sun was still shining, the music still playing, and behind me, I could hear the shuffling confusion of people trying to figure out what had just happened and whether it was polite to resume smiling for the camera. But I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The messages started pouring in before I even made it back to the freeway, a flood of notifications lighting on my phone one after the other, vibrating against the passenger seat like some desperate heartbeat. First, there was the family group chat, blowing up with my mother's clipped sentences. Olivia's theatrics, my father's cold, strategic phrasing. Then came the direct messages, texts from aunts I hadn't seen in years and cousins who never remembered my birthday, all suddenly finding their voices now that I had disrupted the script. The tone shifted from shock to scorn so quickly it was almost dizzying. How dare you do this to Olivia? At her wedding of all days. How selfish. How ungrateful. No one asked if I was okay. No one questioned why I might have done what I did. No one offered even a flicker of reflection. They just wanted their image back, the tidy narrative, the obedient daughter who knew her place and kept her silence. I didn't respond to a single message. I powered off the phone and left it in a drawer. I told myself I'd check it in a week, maybe longer, maybe never. And in the quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, an aching, unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't peace exactly. Not yet. But it was the space where peace might eventually live, if I kept clearing room for it. I poured myself into preparing for my new job, waking up early and reviewing technical briefs over coffee while the city was still half asleep. I organized my apartment down to the last drawer, building systems that made me feel grounded, labeled jars in the pantry, charging stations, carefully folded linens in drawers I had bought with my own money. I built a life around structure, around decisions I made for myself, not because I had to prove anything but because I finally had room to move without tiptoeing around other people's needs. I spent long afternoons walking through hardware stores and thrift shops, picking out lighting fixtures and secondhand bookshelves, choosing paint samples and curtain rods with an almost reverent focus. I framed my degree, the one no one had ever congratulated me for, and hung it in my living room above my desk. I bought a set of tools and taught myself how to mount shelves, patch drywall, and rewire a light switch. I liked the feeling of a screwdriver in my palm, the satisfaction of tightening something into place, and knowing it would stay because I made it that way. But at night, when the world quieted and there was no work left to do, the doubt crept in. Not loud. Just enough to take the edge off the clarity I'd earned. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing my father's voice in the back of my mind. Disappointment masked as discipline. Affection bartered for compliance. I thought about the look on Olivia's face when I handed over that envelope, a mixture of confusion and embarrassment, like she couldn't understand how I had slipped out of the role she had always assumed I'd play. I thought about my mother's expression, tight-lipped, angry, not because I'd hurt her, but because I'd humiliated her in front of people who mattered to her more than I ever had. There were nights when I questioned everything, whether it had been too much, whether I had crossed a line, whether I had truly burned the bridge or just exposed the fact that it had never been built to carry my weight in the first place. But even in those moments, when guilt pressed at my ribs like a too-tight sweater, I never regretted it. Because that guilt wasn't born of wrongdoing, it was residue, the leftover wiring from a lifetime of being conditioned to carry responsibility that didn't belong to me. It was the echo of years spent apologizing for taking up space, for asking to be seen, for needing anything at all. And now, in the quiet hum of my apartment, surrounded by plants I had potted with my own hands and furniture I had built with my own tools, I was learning to let that echo fade. I didn't miss the noise. I didn't miss the performance. I didn't miss the role they had written for me and expected me to deliver with a smile. What I had now wasn't perfect. It was lonely sometimes. It was quiet in a way that sometimes made my ears ring. But it was mine. Fully, absolutely mine. And that, more than anything they could offer or threaten or withhold, was enough. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was no longer the background character. I had stepped out of the frame, and I had no intention of ever stepping back in. It was just after 7 on a Sunday evening when the knock came. I almost didn't answer. I was barefoot in an old hoodie, halfway through assembling a new bookshelf, my hands still smudged with pencil marks from measuring wall studs. The knock wasn't tentative or polite. It was sharp, quick, the kind of knock that didn't wait for permission. I walked over, half expecting a delivery I hadn't ordered or maybe a neighbor complaining about the drilling earlier. But when I opened the door, it was Olivia. She was standing there in a tailored cream coat and heels too thin for the cracked concrete of my building's entrance, her arms crossed tightly, not from the cold, but from something sharper. Her eyes were puffy, like she hadn't slept or had cried recently and tried to cover it up with makeup. For a second, neither of us said anything. She just stared at me, jaw tight, her whole body bracing for impact. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside without a word and watched her walk in like she didn't know what she was supposed to be doing. Her eyes scanned the apartment, pausing on the bookshelves, the neatly organized workspace, the framed degree above the desk. She looked like she was seeing it for the first time, but also like she didn't know what to do with what she was seeing. She turned to me abruptly, her voice sharp and unsteady. "You couldn't just talk to me? You had to make a scene at my wedding." Her words came out fast, like she had rehearsed them. "You humiliated Dad. You embarrassed Mom. You made it all about you." I didn't react at first. I let her get it out. I stood there, arms crossed, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching the fury bleed through her controlled posture. It was the same tone she used when someone got her coffee order wrong, or when the valet scratched her car. But underneath, I heard something else, panic, maybe. Or confusion. I walked to the sink, poured a glass of water, and handed it to her. She took it without thanking me. "I didn't make it about me," I said finally. "I made it about getting free." She rolled her eyes but didn't interrupt, so I kept going. I told her, slowly and without apology, about everything she had missed while she'd been busy being the center of our family's universe. I told her about the scholarships, the nights I spent tutoring and folding sweaters at the campus store to pay for food, the internship that changed my life, the job offer from Helix. I told her about graduating top of my class with no one in the audience. I told her about watching our parents spend thousands on her lifestyle while I begged for printer ink. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the glass in her hand like she didn't recognize it. Then she said quietly, "You never told me any of that." "Would it have mattered?" I asked, not accusing, just tired. "Every time I tried to talk about school or work, you changed the subject to whatever you were planning next. You were always the show." And I stopped trying to interrupt it. There was a long silence. I thought she might double down, get defensive, storm out. But she didn't. She sat down on the edge of my couch, placed the glass carefully on the coffee table, and rested her hands in her lap, like she didn't know what to do with them. "I didn't know," she said, and for the first time, her voice wasn't sharp. It was small. "I thought you liked being alone. I thought you didn't want to be part of everything. I figured you were just different." "I am," I said. "But that doesn't mean I didn't want to be seen." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were wet again. Not the dramatic tears she used to get out of trouble or pull focus. Real ones. Quiet ones. "I was awful to you," she said. "Not just at the wedding. I've been awful for years." I didn't answer. I just let her sit with that. She rubbed her hands together like she was cold, even though the apartment was warm. "I used to think you were judging me. That you thought you were better than me, because you were smart. And maybe I leaned into being the pretty one, the fun one, because I didn't think I could keep up with you in other ways." "You never had to keep up," I said. "I just wanted you to care." She looked at me like she was trying to rewind the last 10 years in her head, trying to find a place where she could have done something differently and maybe held on to me a little longer before I disappeared. "I want to try," she said finally. "I don't know if we can fix everything, but I want to try. For real. No audience. No parents. Just us." For the first time that evening, I felt something soften in me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a space where something could live, if I let it. I nodded just once. She stayed for another hour. We didn't solve anything. We didn't untangle decades of family mess in one night. But we sat on my couch and talked, not about weddings or drama or who owed who, but about music, about her new job, about the way we used to play flashlight tag in the backyard before everything got complicated. And when she left, she hugged me, not stiffly, not for show. She held on like she meant it. I didn't hug back at first, but after a moment I did. It was a Tuesday morning when I got the message. I was sitting at my desk, laptop open, reviewing data from a recent project launch when the notification flashed across my screen, a short, hesitant text from an unfamiliar number. "Hi, Emily. It's Trevor, Olivia's husband. I hope this isn't weird, but I was wondering if we could talk. I have a few questions, and I think you're the only one who can really answer them." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. We hadn't spoken beyond polite nods during the chaos of the wedding, and I had no idea what he might want now. Still, curiosity won out over caution. We scheduled a call for later that afternoon, and when it came, his voice on the other end was steady, but noticeably strained. "I'm not sure where to start," he said, after the initial small talk ran dry. "Your dad asked me for more money this morning. Again." That got my attention. I straightened up in my chair, every instinct sharpening. "Again?" He sighed. "Yeah. First it was for a quick loan a few weeks before the wedding. He said it was for a short-term cash flow issue, some investment that hadn't paid out yet. 20,000. I gave it to him because Well, he's Olivia's dad, and it seemed important. I didn't tell Liv at the time because I figured he'd pay it back, and I didn't want to stress her before the wedding. But now he's back. This time, he says it's urgent. Like something big is at risk. I close my laptop slowly, the air in the room tightening. He told me he was still paying your tuition. Trevor continued, more cautiously now. He made it sound like he was stretched thin because of all the help he was giving you. He said you needed support while getting on your feet, that you were struggling. I let out a bitter, humorless laugh before I could stop myself. He said that? Yeah, Trevor said. And I believed him. Until, well, Olivia told me what happened at the wedding. And then she mentioned that check you gave him. And now I don't know what to think. I took a breath and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a second before responding. Trevor, he hasn't paid for anything of mine in years. Not tuition, not rent, not books, not a single thing. I graduated over a year ago, summa cum laude. I've had a full-time job at Helix since then. I've been fully independent since the second semester of college. That $13,000 check I gave him? That was reimbursement for the only financial support I ever got from him. One semester. After that, I paid for everything myself. He was silent for a moment. I could hear the quiet buzz of traffic in the background, as if he had stepped outside to take the call. Jesus Christ, he muttered eventually. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, I said. They've been curating a version of events for years. One where I'm the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who owes them everything and never gives anything back. It keeps the story clean. It makes them look generous. It erases the fact that I've been on my own since I was 19. I feel like an idiot, he said. You're not, I replied. They're just really good at playing the part. They know how to sound selfless when they want something. They know how to twist guilt into gratitude. And they've been doing it so long, it probably doesn't even feel like lying to them anymore. There was another pause. Then, quietly, he said, I need to tell Olivia. You should. Later that night, Olivia called me. Her voice was tight and shaking, the kind of tone that came after a screaming match. She didn't waste time. They admitted it, she said. I confronted them, and they admitted it. She was pacing as she spoke. I could hear her footsteps echoing on tile. They said they may have exaggerated. How much they helped you. That's how they put it. Exaggerated. Then it all spilled out. They're in serious debt. Dad made some bad investments and didn't tell Mom until it was too late. They've been juggling credit cards and pretending everything's fine. The wedding was a financial disaster, Emily. They couldn't afford half of it, but they went ahead with everything because they didn't want anyone to know. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise. Not even anger. Just a strange, heavy confirmation of what I'd always suspected, that their pride mattered more than their stability, that appearances had always been worth more to them than people. They said they thought you wouldn't understand. Olivia continued, her voice thick. That you'd use it against them. That you'd never help. They blamed you even now. I already gave them what they wanted, I said. I cleared the debt. They just didn't realize they'd already burned the bridge. Olivia was quiet for a long time after that. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't catch it, she said, I don't know who they are anymore. I do, I said. I always have. The call came in just after 9 on a Thursday night, while I was washing dishes and listening to a podcast, trying to unwind after a long day. I saw my mother's name light up the screen and instinctively braced myself. We hadn't spoken since the fallout with Olivia and the check at the wedding, and I hadn't expected to hear from her so soon, especially not directly. I dried my hands slowly, turned off the faucet, and answered, already feeling my stomach tighten. Her voice was frantic, the kind of tight, rushed panic that doesn't wait for a response. She told me my father had suffered a heart attack earlier that day, that he was in the hospital, that he was stable now, but that it had been serious. I felt a cold wave move through my chest, not grief exactly, but something heavy and dense, a complicated swell of worry, resentment, disbelief, and distant affection that I didn't know how to hold all at once. I didn't interrupt her. I let her talk. I asked which hospital. I wrote it down. I said I was glad he was alive. But then, almost too smoothly, her tone shifted. Not completely. There was still a thread of urgency, but the chaos softened into something more controlled, more deliberate. She began talking about how this was a wake-up call, how the stress had finally caught up to him, how he had been trying to keep the business afloat for the family, how things had gotten out of hand, and now someone needed to step up. I could feel it coming before she said it. I knew that pivot all too well. The move from concern to calculation, the way she wrapped manipulation in soft, maternal packaging. "He can't keep running things like this," she said. "He's not 20 anymore, Emily. The doctor said he needs rest, real rest. Someone has to step in. The business is hanging by a thread." I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter, gripping the edge with my free hand. "And you want me to run it?" I said flatly. "It's the only logical option," she replied quickly. "You're the responsible one. You understand finances. You've always been so good with numbers. And it's your family's legacy." There it was. Legacy. Obligation dressed up as honor. Guilt in the language of tradition. I stayed silent for a few seconds, letting the air between us stretch uncomfortably. "I'm not doing that," I said. She was quiet then, for a beat too long. Then came the next layer, disappointment cloaked in hurt. "He's your father, Emily. He nearly died. You can't just walk away from this." I didn't walk away, I said, keeping my voice calm. "I was pushed. And now that everything's falling apart, you're trying to drag me back to fix it. But I'm not going to set my life on fire to salvage his mistakes." "You're exaggerating." "No, I'm not," I interrupted. "I've worked for everything I have. I built my career with no help from either of you. I didn't get a cent past my first semester, and you told everyone that you were still supporting me. You lied. You used me to keep up appearances. And now that the truth is out, now that the weight of those lies is collapsing around you, you're calling me and asking for more." She made a small sound, maybe shock or indignation, but I kept going. "This isn't just about Dad's health. This is about the company failing. This is about you needing someone to take responsibility, so you don't have to admit you lost control. But I'm not your backup plan. I'm not your insurance policy. And I'm not going to sacrifice the life I've built for a man who has spent years pretending I didn't exist unless he needed something." Her voice cracked slightly, the edges of desperation finally bleeding through. "We don't have anyone else. Who else is going to do it?" "Then maybe it shouldn't be saved," I said. "If it was built on lies and control and secrecy, maybe it's better off falling apart. I'm sorry he's sick. I truly am. But I will not be manipulated into thinking his heart attack is my responsibility." She went silent again. I could hear her breathing, uneven, like she didn't know where to go next. "If you want to talk about how he's doing, if you want to update me on his health, I'll listen," I said. "But if you're going to keep using that to try and guilt me into fixing your financial mess, don't call again." I waited for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. So I ended the call. Then I stood in the middle of my quiet apartment, surrounded by everything I had earned, everything I had built with my own hands and choices, and I let the silence settle over me again, this time as protection, not punishment. I had drawn a line. And for once, I didn't feel the need to cross it. There was a morning that I still remember in detail, not because of anything dramatic or chaotic, but because of the stillness before the moment I had been working toward finally arrived. I had gotten into the habit of arriving early to the Helix office, sometimes before the sun even pushed past the horizon, before the usual bustle of designers, engineers, and analysts filled the halls with conversation and coffee runs. That day, I was the first one in again, dressed in a tailored black suit, with my hair pulled back and my presentation already loaded onto the shared server twice, with a backup copy in my bag. Everything I needed was already prepared, every calculation double-checked, every projection modeled from 3 angles. It wasn't nerves that had me up at 5:30 a.m., it was the weight of something I had built with my own hands finally being put on the table for the world to see. Helix had been chasing the Portland Sustainability Initiative for over a year, a massive municipal project aimed at reimagining the city's energy, waste, and infrastructure systems for the next 3 decades. It was a contract that would define careers, shape policy, and rewrite expectations for what sustainable urban design could look like. I had joined the team that summer, pulled in not just as a junior analyst, but as someone with real input, real ownership, over the models that would drive our recommendations. It wasn't a hand-me-down assignment. It was mine. I was the one who had redesigned our runoff reclamation model for the urban flood zones, optimized the graywater reuse system for community centers, and built the environmental impact simulation tool we were using to compare life cycle emissions against the competing proposals. The city council meeting was held in one of those old, echoing chambers that smelled faintly of varnish and time, with polished wooden benches and uncomfortable chairs arranged in tidy rows behind a horseshoe of microphones. I had presented to plenty of rooms before, conferences, internal reviews, technical panels, but nothing quite like this. The stakes weren't abstract here. Portland's council members were notorious for asking blunt, Technical questions that ignored the polish of corporate rhetoric and got straight to the bones of a proposal. When my name was called to speak, I stood, walked to the podium with steady steps, and introduced myself without looking at the notes I didn't need. I explained the core of our model in language accessible to non-engineers, but didn't dumb it down. I showed how our systems would reduce potable water demand by 27% across the city within the first 5 years. I walked them through the data behind our emissions calculations, our cost recovery curve, the timeline, the margin for error. I used the software tool I had coded myself to simulate rainfall events and demonstrate how our reclamation system would respond in real time. Then came the questions, everything from material sourcing to labor concerns, scalability, long-term resilience. I answered every one, not with rehearsed pitches, but with practiced clarity. I didn't stammer. I didn't soften. I spoke as someone who belonged in the room, because I did. A few weeks later, the announcement came through in the form of an email to the entire Helix team, with the subject line in all caps, Portland chose US. The office exploded with cheers, people pouring out of their offices and meeting rooms to celebrate with impromptu applause and champagne. I stood next to my manager, who handed me a glass with a grin and said, "You nailed it. They mentioned you by name. Twice." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just smiled, wide and real, and held that glass like it weighed everything I had fought for. A week later, the local business paper ran a story on Helix and our role in winning the bid. The article wasn't long, but there was a paragraph that caught my eye near the end, after the technical breakdowns and contract highlights. It read, "One of the standout moments during the pitch came from Helix analyst Emily Hartwell, a valedictorian graduate of the University of California system with a specialization in environmental engineering. Hartwell's innovative modeling software helped solidify confidence in Helix's proposal, and her detailed presentation of the firm's water reclamation design drew praise from several council members." I stared at that paragraph longer than I probably should have. Not because of the recognition, though it felt good, but because of that one word, valedictorian. There it was, printed in black and white, for a city to read. A word my parents had never spoken aloud. A title I had earned and carried like a hidden badge because it had meant nothing to the people who should have been proud. And now, in this moment, it belonged to me fully, claimed and visible and written into the record by someone who saw it and understood its worth. I clipped the article and saved a digital copy. Not to send to anyone. Not to prove anything. But to keep for myself as a reminder of what I had done. Not just the win, not just the contract, but the life I had built that they couldn't take credit for, couldn't rewrite, couldn't dim. This success wasn't theirs. It never had been. It was mine from start to finish. The first envelope arrived 2 days after the article ran. Cream-colored, heavyweight paper, the kind reserved for holiday cards or sympathy notes, addressed in my mother's handwriting, looping and precise. Inside was a clipped copy of the article, carefully folded and creased with intention, as if she'd pressed it between books overnight. No note, no signature, just the article. A gesture more symbolic than sincere, like she wanted to be associated with the story without actually entering it. Over the next few days, more letters followed. Some in her handwriting, others in my father's tighter, more clinical scrawl. There were more clippings, one of them laminated, another framed in a silver border with a blue mat, school colors, probably chosen deliberately. One letter included a line that stuck with me. "We are so proud of everything you've accomplished, even if we didn't say it before." Another said, "You've always been brilliant. We just didn't know how to show it." But it all felt like performance, a retrospective declaration meant to patch over years of silence and absence. The recognition I had wanted as a teenager meant nothing to me now that it was tethered to public validation. It felt hollow, like applause from people who had only noticed you because the spotlight finally landed. I didn't respond. Not at first. I stacked the letters in a drawer and left the frames unopened in their bubble wrap. I told myself I was protecting my peace, that silence was its own answer. But beneath that, I also knew I wasn't ready to believe them. Not yet. Then, a week later, the email came. It was from my father. The subject line was simple. "I'd like to talk if you're willing." I opened it without hesitation, not because I expected anything different, but because something in me was curious, skeptical, but curious. The message was short, unusually so for him, who had always favored long-winded monologues and advice no one asked for. But this time, it was stripped down. Plain. There was no manipulation, no guilt, no praise. Just a few lines. He wrote that he'd read the article and that he hadn't realized how much of my success he had missed. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted a chance to talk, honestly, without pretense. He admitted he hadn't known how to handle me when I was younger, that he had tried to control what he didn't understand, that he'd mistaken silence for strength and distance for discipline. He wrote that he was retiring, stepping away from the business, and thinking a lot about what mattered now that he had nothing left to prove. At the end, he said something that caught me off guard. "If you ever want to tell me who you really are, I'll listen. No defenses. No lectures." I read it twice. Then again. There was no grand apology, no sweeping redemption arc. But for the first time in my memory, his words weren't about himself. They didn't orbit around expectation or disappointment. They were open, uncertain, human. We met a week later at a quiet cafe downtown. Neutral ground. I wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, nothing that made a statement. He wore a navy blazer I recognized from a dozen forced family photos, but no tie. When I walked in, he stood up like it was a reflex he hadn't used in years. We didn't hug. We sat. The conversation started awkwardly, with small talk about the coffee, the rain, the noise level. But it shifted quickly. I told him I didn't come for closure, because I wasn't interested in pretending the past hadn't happened. I came because I wanted to hear what he had to say, without excuses. And, to my surprise, he didn't deflect. He didn't rewrite history or minimize the damage. He looked me in the eyes and said he had failed me, not in some vague, abstract way, but directly, as a father. He said he had prioritized control over connection. He admitted he had admired me but never showed it because he didn't know how to relate to someone who didn't need his approval to succeed. I told him about the day I gave him that check at the wedding, how that wasn't about spite, it was about freedom. I told him about the internships he never asked about, the graduation he didn't attend, the hospital visit that never happened. I told him I had carried that silence for so long, it had become part of my spine. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when I was finished, he said, "I'm sorry. Not because you're successful now, but because I made you feel like you had to do it all alone." I believed him. Not entirely. Not enough to sweep everything away, but enough to stay a little longer. We talked for over an hour. He didn't ask for a second chance, but I gave him the terms of one anyway. I told him we could rebuild something, but only if it was slow, honest, and completely on my terms. I wasn't going to sacrifice boundaries to make him feel better. I wasn't going to pretend we had a foundation we never built. I didn't need a father figure. I needed truth, consistency, and space. He agreed. When we stood to leave, he reached for a handshake, another reflex, but I surprised both of us by pulling him into a quick, stiff hug. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was wet and reflective, and the world looked softer than it had when I'd arrived. I walked away alone, but lighter. Not because everything had healed, but because for once, I wasn't the one carrying all of it anymore. The news came gradually, never in a single phone call or headline, but as a series of confirmations layered over time, first through Olivia, then in public records, and finally through a short, hollow message from my father. They had lost the house. The one in Santa Clara, with the manicured lawn and the expensive hydrangeas my mother paid a gardener to fertilize twice a month. The house they had clung to like a symbol of their identity, the facade they maintained long after the financial rot had already begun to spread. It was gone. Foreclosed. Their bankruptcy filing was quiet, strategic, the way my father did everything, without admission, without apology, but total in its finality. Olivia, to her credit, didn't sugarcoat it. She called one evening and laid everything out in a calm, measured voice. She didn't ask for money, didn't cry or plead or use that familiar family tone where every sentence was a veiled obligation. She just said what had happened and that she was helping where she could. Helping with basics, food, temporary housing, medical paperwork, but refusing to play savior. She had grown in ways I hadn't expected, not just since the wedding, but in the slow unraveling of the years that followed. She was still Olivia, still emotional, still impulsive, but there was a groundedness now, something solid underneath. She didn't excuse what our parents had done, didn't deny the damage. She called it what it was, failure, not just financial, but relational. She wasn't trying to fix them. She was setting limits. And I respected her for that. As for me, I kept my distance. Not out of spite, but because distance had become its own kind of safety, a border I maintained not to punish anyone, but to protect the life I had built without their interference. I didn't write checks. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't swoop in with the stability they had once denied me. That wasn't revenge. That was balance. They were reaping the shape of their own decisions, and I wasn't going to contort myself to soften the blow. By then, I had started grad school part-time. I enrolled in a program focused on sustainable urban policy, balancing evening classes with full days at Helix. My work had deepened, more leadership, more trust, more autonomy, and my world expanded in ways that made room for learning, curiosity, and something like peace. I spent my weekends in used bookstores and community forums, my nights writing policy proposals and refining research papers. Not because anyone was watching, but because I wanted to. Because I had built a life that made space for who I was when no one was trying to rewrite me. I thought about family sometimes, what it meant, how it had changed. I no longer felt obligated to fit myself into someone else's version of it. I saw Olivia more often now. We met for coffee, walked in quiet neighborhoods, shared stories we hadn't known we were both carrying. She told me once that she envied my strength. I told her I envied her ability to forgive. We didn't agree on everything, but we had stopped trying to win, to perform. We were building something new, sisterhood not based in shared history, but in shared clarity. We talked about boundaries like grown women. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. But we didn't let it define every conversation either. That was enough. And every so often, I would think back to that envelope, that folded piece of paper I handed to my father beneath the glare of the wedding photographer's lights, the eyes of our extended family locked on us like an audience desperate for a twist. The check wasn't about $13,000. It never had been. That number was incidental. That number was a placeholder for everything they thought I owed them, for every ounce of control they had tried to keep through guilt, silence, and selective memory. That check was a declaration, a severing, a return of power. It said, I see what you've done, and I refuse to be shaped by it. It said, you cannot claim what you never nurtured. It said, I am not your success story, your trophy, your redemption. It wasn't money I gave them that day. It was the illusion of leverage dissolved and gone. And in its place, I built something better. A life where I answer to myself. A future written in my own language. A name that means something not because it was inherited, but because I made it mean something. And I carry that with me every day, not as a burden, but as liberation.